For centuries, the giant stone figures of Rapa Nui have created the same impossible question. How did a society living on one of the most isolated inhabited islands on Earth carve hundreds of multi-ton statues, move them across rugged volcanic terrain, and place them upright on ceremonial platforms? The statues are enormous, the island is remote, the roads are ancient, and there are no surviving machines, carts, or written engineering manuals explaining what happened. For generations, researchers proposed different answers. Maybe the statues were dragged horizontally over logs, maybe enormous teams hauled them across wooden tracks, maybe sophisticated systems of ropes, sledges, and rollers were involved. Then archaeologists went back to the evidence itself and examined something most people never notice: the shape of the statues that were abandoned along the ancient roads. The result is extraordinary. A 2025 study in the Journal of Archaeological Science analyzed 962 moai, including 62 statues associated with ancient roads, combined archaeological measurements with three-dimensional modeling and experimental archaeology, and concluded that the evidence strongly supports vertical transport in a controlled rocking motion. In other words, the statues may really have been designed to walk, not magically, not by themselves. People move them, but they use the shape of the statues, ropes, balance, and coordinated motion to make massive stone figures advance step by step. And that discovery changes the question from how could people possibly move these statues to something far more interesting. What if the statues were engineered from the beginning to move exactly this way? Rapa Nui, commonly called Easter Island, is one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth. It sits thousands of kilometers from continental South America in the southeastern Pacific. Its Polynesian population developed a distinctive society with its own political structures, religious traditions, agricultural systems, and monumental architecture. The Moai became the most visible expression of that world. More than 1,000 monumental statues are known on the island, although only a portion were ever completed, transported, or placed on ceremonial platforms known as ahu. The statues were carved primarily from volcanic tuff at Rano Raraku, the island's principal quarry. Some are enormous. One of the largest known statues reaches roughly 10 meters in height and would have weighed many tens of tons if successfully moved. Around 500 statues are known from roads and transport contexts, while others stand on ahu or remain unfinished at the quarry. The sheer scale of the project makes transportation the central engineering question. Yet the islanders had no draft animals, no wheeled transport system, and no evidence of an industrial workforce. Whatever method they used had to work with human muscle, ropes, stone tools, and the landscape available on Rapa Nui. The old picture often imagined the moai lying horizontally on wooden sledges, dragged across logs by large teams. Such a method is not physically impossible. Humans have moved enormous stones in many places, using rollers, sledges, levers, ropes, and organized labor. The problem is that the archaeology of Rapa Nui does not fit every version of the horizontal transport model equally well. The roads associated with the statues have unusual shapes. Many are relatively broad, averaging around 4.5 meters in the areas studied, with concave cross-sections. That means the transport routes were not simply flat paths cut into the ground. Their shape could help control the movement of a standing statue. Then there are the moai themselves. Statues found along the roads tend to share specific characteristics: unusually broad, D-shaped bases, and a forward lean. Their proportions are not identical to the finished statues standing on ahu. This matters because a statue optimized for standing permanently upright is not necessarily shaped like one optimized for controlled movement. The 2025 study argues that the statues abandoned along the roads preserve precisely the features expected of transport forms. Now imagine trying to move one. A conventional instinct would be to pull it forward. But a moai is not a rectangular block. It is tall, narrow, asymmetrical, and top-heavy. If you can make it lean slightly forward, gravity begins to help. The statue does not need to be lifted completely off the ground. Instead, one side of the base can be rocked while ropes stabilize and control the movement. Pull from one side, and the statue tilts. Pull from another, and it rocks back. The base pivots slightly, shifting the statue forward. Repeat the motion rhythmically, and the figure advances. Instead of fighting the entire weight of the stone, they are directing a sequence of small falls. Each fall makes forward progress. This is a completely different engineering philosophy from dragging a heavy block. It uses the statue itself as part of the machine. The stone's shape becomes the mechanism. That is why the latest analysis is important. Researchers are not simply proposing a method that happens to work. They are arguing that the statues themselves contained physical evidence of what they were designed to do. The strongest test came from experimental archaeology. Researchers did not simply draw diagrams or run computer models. They built a precise 35 metric ton replica based on the characteristics of a real road moai. The replica was given the broad base and forward lean that distinguished the transport statues. Then, a team of 18 people used ropes to move it in the walking motion. The result was startlingly effective. The replica traveled 100 meters in about 40 minutes. That does not mean the ancient builders necessarily moved every statue at exactly that speed, and it does not prove every Moai traveled by exactly the same technique. But it demonstrates that the proposed mechanism can work under physical conditions. The experiment also showed why getting the shape right matters. Earlier attempts to move replicas vertically had sometimes used forms more representative of completed Ahu statues rather than road statues. When researchers used a more accurate transport form, the movement became much more efficient. The number 18 is worth pausing over because it changes the scale of the problem. One common mental image of ancient megalithic construction is thousands of people pulling on ropes until a giant block finally moves. Such projects can require enormous labor if the object is dragged horizontally and friction is high. The walking technique changes the calculation. The statue's weight remains enormous, but the force needed at each moment can be much smaller because gravity supplies much of the motion. Researchers therefore argue that the method could have required substantially fewer workers than some horizontal transport scenarios. It would also reduce the need for vast quantities of timber for rollers or sledges. That does not mean trees played no role anywhere on Rapa Nui, or that wood was irrelevant to island history. It means that the specific question of moving the statues does not necessarily require the massive timber infrastructure traditionally imagined. The stone could move with ropes and coordinated human effort. And now we reach the strangest evidence of all, the statues that never arrived. Along the ancient roads from Rano Raraku, archaeologists have found Moai abandoned at different stages of transport. Some are upright or nearly upright. Others are broken. Their positions are not random. The 2025 study analyzed the distribution of 62 road statues and compared their distances from the quarry with statistical models. Researchers found that 6% of these statues occur within 2 kilometers of Rano Raraku. Their frequency decreases with distance in a pattern the authors interpret as consistent with mechanical failure during transport. That makes intuitive sense. If a statue falls early in the journey and cannot be recovered, it remains near the quarry. Only statues that successfully survive repeated movements can continue farther down the road. Over long distances, the number of surviving transported statues naturally decreases. The pattern, therefore, resembles a transport system in which failures accumulate over distance, rather than a collection of statues deliberately placed at ceremonial sites. The broken statues add another clue. If a Moai were dragged horizontally and suddenly struck the ground, one might expect damage patterns reflecting horizontal forces. But the research team argues that many broken road statues show patterns consistent with falling from a standing position. Again, that does not provide an individual movie of what happened thousands of years ago. Archaeology almost never gives us that luxury. Instead, researchers compare multiple independent clues. The shape predicts a walking system. The roads provide a compatible surface. The broken statues show damage, consistent with vertical falls. Their geographical distribution fits repeated transport failures. And an experimental replica demonstrates that the proposed system physically works. When several independent lines of evidence converge, the hypothesis becomes much stronger than any one piece alone. There is also something deeply fascinating about the road itself. If the Moai were meant to walk, the road becomes more than a path. It becomes infrastructure engineered around movement. Its width gives room for people holding ropes. Its concave shape may help stabilize the statue. The landscape becomes part of the transport system. That is important because ancient engineering is often misunderstood as the application of brute force. But real engineering frequently works by shaping the environment so that the object becomes easier to control. A road can reduce friction. A slope can add gravitational assistance. A lever can multiply force. A rope can change direction. A shaped base can turn gravity into forward motion. The Rapa Nui builders may have understood these principles through observation and generations of practical experience without writing the equations down. They did not need modern physics terminology to use physics correctly. And perhaps the most beautiful part of the hypothesis is that it fits the oral tradition. Traditional Rapa Nui accounts describe the Moai as having walked from the quarry. For decades, outsiders could have interpreted this as metaphor, mythology, or ceremonial language. But if people literally move the statues in a controlled rocking motion, the word suddenly becomes remarkably practical. The statues did not walk because they possessed life. They walked because people made them walk. Oral tradition preserved the image of movement even while the engineering technique disappeared from everyday knowledge. Modern experiments cannot prove that ancient people used exactly the same ropes or exactly the same choreography described in every later account, but the broad correspondence between the oral tradition and the physical evidence is difficult to ignore. However, this is not the end of the debate. Other researchers have proposed or defended alternative transport mechanisms. Some experiments have used sledges, rollers, or different forms of upright movement. Critics of the walking hypothesis have raised questions about rough terrain, weathering, rope availability, road conditions, and whether enormous statues could remain stable during long journeys. The authors of the 2025 study explicitly address those criticisms and argue that the alternative interpretations do not explain the full archaeological dataset as well as vertical walking does. But that distinction matters. Best supported explanation is not the same as mathematically proven beyond any possibility of alternative. Archaeology works through probabilities and converging evidence. The walking hypothesis has become stronger because it explains more observations with fewer assumptions. But future discoveries can still refine or challenge the details. The newer research also changes another famous story about Rapa Nui. For decades, the island was often presented as the ultimate example of ecological self-destruction. In the popular version, islanders cut down their forests to transport giant statues, exhausted the resources of the island, destroyed their own ecosystem, and experienced a dramatic demographic collapse before Europeans arrived. That narrative became so famous that Rapa Nui was sometimes presented as a warning about modern civilization. But archaeological and genetic research has complicated it considerably. The ancient DNA record does not support a simple pre-European population collapse on the scale once imagined. A 2024 study of 15 ancient Rapa Nui individuals found no genetic signal of a severe population bottleneck before European contact, and instead supported continuity with the modern population. Other recent archaeological work has similarly challenged simplistic ecocide interpretations. This does not mean the island environment was unaffected by human activity. Deforestation and landscape transformation clearly occurred. It means the story cannot be reduced to one catastrophic act of self-destruction. The walking hypothesis matters to that debate because it reduces the need to imagine enormous amounts of timber being consumed just to move every statue. If Moai could be transported vertically with ropes and relatively small teams, then statues did not necessarily require massive wooden rollers. That does not mean all environmental changes on Rapa Nui become irrelevant. The island had limited resources, and Polynesian settlers transformed its vegetation, soils, and ecosystems. But the relationship between statue building and forest loss becomes more complicated. The statues may have demanded impressive engineering without requiring the islanders to destroy their entire woodland system simply to move stone. Monumental construction and ecological damage are no longer automatically treated as the same problem. The 2025 research at Reanalyzed adds another layer. Scientists used more than 11,000 aerial photographs to create a comprehensive three-dimensional model of the quarry. The project captured thousands of images using unmanned aerial vehicles, producing detailed photogrammetric models of the crater and its archaeological features. What the researchers found was not a single centrally organized factory. Instead, the quarry contained roughly 30 distinct areas of production, with different concentrations of carving features and evidence for multiple workshops operating simultaneously. Some unfinished statues remained attached to bedrock by narrow keels, showing how carvers worked around the figure before finally separating it from the volcanic cliff. The spatial pattern supports the idea that statue production was organized across multiple relatively autonomous groups rather than one giant centralized workshop controlled from a single command center. That changes how we picture the society that created the Moai. Imagine not a massive state with one ruler commanding thousands of anonymous laborers, but many communities, families, or kin groups participating in a shared cultural tradition. Each group could quarry statues, develop its own carving practices, and coordinate with others. The quarry itself becomes a landscape of workshops. The statues are monumental, but the organization behind them may have been decentralized. That is a very different kind of complexity. It demonstrates that monumental architecture does not automatically require a centralized bureaucratic state. Communities can cooperate, compete, and innovate while remaining politically decentralized. The 2025 quarry study specifically connects the spatial organization of Moai production with archaeological and ethnohistoric evidence for relatively autonomous kin-based communities on Rapa Nui. Now, return to the quarry. Reanalyzed is one of the strangest archaeological landscapes on the planet. Dozens of statues remain partially embedded in volcanic rock. Others stand unfinished. Some appear to be only partly carved. Some were never separated from the cliff. These unfinished figures are important because they reveal the production sequence. The archaeologists can see where carving stopped. They can see how the carvers shaped the torso and face. They can identify workspaces. The statues that never left the quarry are effectively abandoned construction sites frozen in stone. It is like discovering an ancient workshop where the workers simply walked away and never came back. Except that instead of broken pottery or half-finished tools, the abandoned products are giant human forms. The statues themselves also changed through the transport process. The road Moai were not identical to the final images placed on Ahu. Researchers argue that transport statues retained broader, more unstable bases and a forward lean because those traits made walking possible. Once a moai arrived at its destination, it could be modified into a more stable standing form. That means the statue changed as it moved through its life cycle. It began as a quarry object, became a transport object, and finally became a ceremonial monument. The body of the moai was not simply carved once. Its physical shape reflected the task it needed to perform. This is another reason the road statues are so valuable. They preserve the engineering stage of the process that disappears once the figure is completed. Think about what that means. For years, archaeologists looked at the statues as finished monuments and asked how people moved them. The latest evidence suggests that the better place to find the answer is not necessarily the most impressive statue standing upright on a platform. It is the abandoned statue lying beside an old road. The failed transport attempts may tell us more than the successful ones. A statue that reached its ahu represents success, but success erases the evidence of the struggle. A statue that fell represents a failure, and failure leaves a physical record. Archaeologists are learning to read those failures as engineering data. This is a lesson that applies far beyond Rapa Nui. Ancient technology is often hidden inside things that did not go according to plan. A broken tool can reveal how it was used. A collapsed building can reveal construction methods. A discarded vessel can reveal manufacturing techniques. An abandoned statue can reveal transportation. The ruins are not just monuments. They are failed experiments left behind by people who had already solved the problem many times before, and that brings us back to the word walk. The moai did not walk like humans. They did not have legs. They did not stand up and move themselves, but a controlled sequence of rocking motions could make the statue advance while remaining upright. One side tilts, the center of mass shifts, the opposite side rises, the ropes tighten, the people pull, the statue rocks and moves forward, then the sequence repeats. 1 meter, another, a massive stone figure slowly traveling across a volcanic island as a coordinated team moves with it. Seen from a distance, it may genuinely have looked alive, and perhaps that was part of the brilliance. The ancient builders did not need to make the statue physically walk forever. They needed to make a stone body behave as though it could move. That is engineering. That is symbolism. And that is exactly the kind of connection archaeology is now revealing. The 962 statue analysis gives this interpretation a much broader foundation than earlier experiments alone. The researchers were not working with one convenient replica. They analyzed a large population of statues and focused on the unusual subset associated with roads. They tested shape, location, breakage, road geometry, and transport failure patterns. Then they connected those results with experimental movement. The hypothesis, therefore, works at multiple scales: the individual statue, the road, the landscape, and the island-wide distribution. That is what makes the current evidence so compelling. Still, the ancient people who built the moai remain more interesting than the statues themselves. They were Polynesian navigators who settled an extraordinarily isolated island and developed a society capable of organizing huge projects without modern machines. They cultivated crops under challenging environmental conditions. They developed food production strategies, such as rock gardens and mulching techniques that altered the island's soils. They created monumental art from volcanic stone. They built ahu. They developed social networks capable of moving objects weighing several tons, and they passed knowledge through generations without written engineering manuals. The island may have been isolated geographically, but it was not culturally stagnant. People experimented. They learned. They adapted. They solved problems. They failed. They changed their methods. And eventually they produced thousands of monumental statues. That is why the old image of Easter Island as a mysterious place where an inexplicable civilization appeared and disappeared is no longer useful. The real Rapa Nui story is much richer. It is the story of Polynesian people building a distinctive society in an extreme environment, transforming their landscape, creating extraordinary monuments, dealing with ecological pressures, and surviving massive disruptions after European contact. Modern archaeology is increasingly focused on the people's own achievements rather than treating the moai as an unsolved puzzle detached from their creators. And now, one of the greatest puzzles may have moved much closer to an answer. The moai may have walked. Not because they were supernatural, not because an unknown civilization gave them hidden technology, not because aliens moved them, because the people who carved them understood their shape well enough to turn gravity into movement. That may be the most satisfying answer of all. The mystery was not that ancient people possessed technology beyond our imagination. The mystery was that we underestimated the technology they already had. They had stones, they had ropes, they had geometry, they had balance, they had coordination, they had generations of observation, and they had a remarkable ability to turn all of those things into an engineering system. The latest research does not close every question surrounding Rapa Nui. It opens more. How exactly were the ropes manufactured? How many people were involved with the largest statues? How were roads prepared before transport? How often did a statue fall? Did different communities use slightly different techniques? How much did the weather alter the roads? And how did the transport system evolve through time? Those questions remain, but the central picture is becoming clearer. The statues were not simply blocks dragged from a quarry. Their shape mattered, their road position mattered, their failures mattered, their final forms mattered, and the experiment mattered. A 35-ton replica moved by 18 people across 100 meters in 40 minutes is not ancient evidence, but it demonstrates that the basic physical mechanism works. The archaeological distribution and morphology then tell us that the ancient statues possessed precisely the features this mechanism requires. Together, those facts give the walking hypothesis a powerful evidential foundation. Meanwhile, the new three-dimensional mapping of Rano Raraku is revealing another truth. The people who created these statues did not necessarily operate as one massive centralized machine. More than 11,000 aerial photographs have exposed a quarry organized into dozens of production zones. Different carving techniques and redundant working areas suggest multiple workshops. The monument tradition was shared across communities, but production could remain decentralized. That combination of collective cultural identity and local autonomy may have been one of the keys to Rapa Nui's remarkable artistic output. So the next time you see a photograph of the Moai, standing silently against the Pacific sky, remember that the statue is only the final frame of a much longer process. First, someone chose the stone. Then someone carved the body. Then someone shaped the base. Then the figure was separated from the mountain. Then ropes were attached. Then people gathered. The statue tilted. The ropes tightened. The stone rocked. And slowly, almost unbelievably, it began to move, step by step, rock by rock, meter by meter, until the enormous human face that had been sleeping inside the volcanic mountain was finally carried across the island toward its new home. Maybe that is why the ancient phrase describing the statues as walking survived, because for the people who watched them move, it may have been the most accurate description possible. They were not dead stone anymore. They were moving bodies. And now, after decades of argument, archaeological mapping, statistical analysis, and physical experiments, scientists have some of the strongest evidence yet that the people of Rapa Nui really did know how to make their giant statues walk. The mystery was never that the Moai moved. The mystery was how. And the answer may have been waiting in their shape the entire time.